Welcome back to another episode of Tons Two Cents. Today's episode is titled The Pitfalls of Incumbency in GovCon. Today, we'll explore the traps that incumbents fall into when they assume that their status alone guarantees success, from ignoring new requirements to overconfidence and poor teaming strategies. We'll unpack why being an incumbent isn't a free pass to win and how to avoid these mistakes. I'm your host, Ton Wilson, and today I'm bringing you real world strategies to sharpen your edge in the GovCon. And our guest today is Brian Lindholm of FedSavvy Strategies. He's a seasoned professional in the GovCon contracting sector. We've been friends for years, decades maybe, and he's the managing principal over at FedSavvy. He brings extensive experience in business development, capture management, and competitive intelligence. Brian's career includes significant roles as a former URS corporation, now Amentum, where he honed his skills in strategic planning and market analysis. His deep understanding of the GovCon landscape makes him a valuable resource for insights into the challenges and opportunities facing incumbents in this dynamic industry. Brian, welcome to our show here today, and say hello and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you very much for having me, Todd. I'm really excited to have this discussion with you. Yeah, I guess I'm just you had a very eloquent introduction. I guess in just the greatest sense, I'm just a gigantic nerd who likes to tackle these sort of market and competitive intelligence problems for people to go after big bids. But I eat that stuff up. I love those puzzles. So this is always a type of a treat of a topic to discuss with as experienced professional as yourself.
Well, I don't know if any of our intellectuals took part in your FedSavvy trivia night, but yes, Brian and his team over at FedSavvy are major GovCon wonks. Everyone here, our listeners are called intellectuals. They're going to be in for a treat here today. So this is jam packed with some pretty good information, which a lot of incumbents and those looking to unseat incumbents are going to find very interesting. But before we dive in to our discussion here today, you've had a very diverse and impressive career. I know you from all of your black hat and all of the great competitive intel that you put out there in industry. But you've had a career where you've navigated several highs and lows in the GovCon world. We've seen a lot that has transpired in this industry since we both have started. Can you, if you could, compare the GovCon industry to a movie or a TV show, what would it be and why?
Yeah, well, I think it's to me the obvious choice is Game of Thrones. This is the world that we both play in is there's so many parallels to Game of Thrones. I remember that I think it was like the first show or maybe the first season where Ned Stark and Cersei Lannister were walking through the garden and then Cersei says, "You play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die." Which I thought set the tone for the entire show. It also sets the tone for the world we play in. There's high stakes, right? You go after these 8, 9 figure bids, and that may be the difference between you as a company having a good year or a bad year or a devastating year. So it gets pretty intense. I think the Game of Thrones, of course, the dying part is loss of revenue, loss of contracts, loss of a lot of prestige even in your business. But and there's a lot of characters, right, that are there that you see the Cerseis of the world who you don't
Mm-hmm.
trust them as far as you can, throw them. You want to maybe take a shower and watch your wallet as you're in the same room with that person. You got the Tyrion Lannister who there's those underdogs, right? You don't see them coming, but they sneak in there and they pull off a Christmas miracle. That's Tyrion to a T, and then guys like Littlefinger who play people against each other and think that they're very clever, but in the end they just of course, we knew what Littlefinger's fate was at the end when what happened to him. But I think, that is what the kind of thing we're world in, and we have to use our cleverness and shrewdness to try to navigate both those characters, but also the intense plot lines that are always indicative of these gigantic pursuits. That there's a lot at stake, and they're not easy. They're very complex to work through, just like the whole plot line and how George R. R. Martin wrote all those Game of Thrones, the Song of Fire and Ice books. So I think that was probably the best analogy to GovCon that I can think of.
Yeah, no, exactly. And And I'd like to play the Khaleesi, so
There you
you
go.
know, there you go. But I do love the Littlefinger character. That character was pretty good, and we're
He
rewatching
was.
it right now. So it never gets old. It never gets
No.
old. So great. Well, this actually sets up a really great foundation for us to kind of get into our first segment, which is the incumbent mindset. A lot of times, just too comfortable to compete, right? So let's start with what I like to call the incumbent mindset. Many incumbents fall into this trap of thinking, I know better than the customer. That's not what they mean in the solicitation. My workforce and my company is irreplaceable. They love us. The platitudes go on and on and on. So, Brian, how do these assumptions kind of set incumbents up for failure? And I think you've got some examples too that you can share in certain cases where these assumptions directly impacted, the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of examples of how that incumbent mindset, right? I think the overarching point is read the room, right? You got to read the
Mhm.
room and understand what you get yourself into, because every new competition is fundamentally new. It might have a wild deviation from the old one. It might have some slight plot twists that happen you didn't expect to see. But to read the room as the incumbent and not assume that past is prologue, that I know better, I'm going to ignore what the RFP says. Well, no, that's called the path to a loss. And I mean, I could be here all day talking about examples of exactly this. I do a routine blog on my own site called the Deadly Sins blog. We go through and look at these wins and losses and what kind of things you can learn from this. So that's the whole idea, is educate, like we're both doing here, educating people out there about what not to do so you don't become another dead body on the lengthy string of unnecessary losses, right? There was, I mean, one example was actually a competition that was back in 2020. It was a company called Ventera versus, really it came down to Ventera and Semantic Bits, who later got bought by ICF. So this was a big software development contract. We got plenty of those in GovCon. It was working on the internet quality improvement and evaluation system. So a bit of a mouthful there. But what was interesting about this is CMS, and this is a little novel thing about them, is they like to do two-phase evaluations. They'll give a
Yeah.
first one. I'm sure you've seen this before, where they'll do a look at your experience. Usually it's a corporate
Hmm.
experience, kind of a narrative. And then they may go, what CMS likes to do is, I'm going to discourage you from going forward because I don't think you're quite ready for live TV.
Right.
It's the way of saying, it's not you, it's me, but it's definitely you.
It's definitely you.
Yeah, definitely
Yeah.
you. And that's what they did. So Ventera was the incumbent. And CMS said, you should sit this one out. But then,
No.
yeah. So Ventera said, nah, I'm good. I'm going to go on. So you wonder then, why on earth would the incumbent been told to sit and go away? Well, what happened in this one is the CMS was very specific. They said, I want my staffing levels for these different agile software development teams to be like this. They specified it. This is what I want to see. And then Tara said, nah, we don't need that. We're going to do
We know
something.
better.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. We know better, right? I'm the incumbent. I'm the boss. I know what's
Hmm.
right. So here's what you're going to get anyway. And CMS said, are you sure about this? Because I told you how I want you to do this. And they said, nah, I don't want to do that. So, of course, they lost. And they lost by a big, big margin. They got curb
Yeah.
stomped. Um, and then, of course, they protested. I know that was a shocker. It's a shocker they protested. So then they protested a lot of parts about the competition. But what the protest revealed was what they, as the incumbent, did wrong, right? What they, as the incumbent, the
Hmm.
traps they fell into, right? The traps they fell into was, like I mentioned, they looked at the requirements. Yeah, I'm not doing that. I'm going to do what I think is right.
It was
So they were
optional.
what most incumbents, well, I shouldn't say most, many incumbents, right? They go, they lean backwards. Well, this is how we've done it. They ignored the leaning forward. They don't see us as this is how I want to get it done going forward. And they just ignored it. Then they started making all sorts of other allegations that were made, like, well, your pricing is unrealistic. For the other guy, like, no. They priced it to what was told them to price. So that's what they did. There was a $30 million gap between the two bidders. That's a pretty sizable gap last time I checked. And then this is where it gets even better with the incumbency trap, right? That goes back to the incumbency problem, is that Ventera said we don't need a transition plan at all. No transition plan whatsoever. It's a new contract. Yes, you do need a transition plan. It may be
So
an
did they
easier
ignore the
transition.
requirement, even though the requirement was in there? They're like, yeah, we're
Yeah,
good. Okay. Wow.
yeah. They just said, we don't need a transition plan. So they were, I mean, frankly, the hubris was kind of shocking, frankly, that
Hmm.
they would just say, I don't need that. I don't need to do that either. Just like, no, the guys paying your bill say you need to do this. So unless you get them to agree to take exception there and allow exceptions, you got to follow the rules and then bid what the RFPs ask you to do. Right? I mean, they were fundamentally non-compliant with what they were asking to do, and they were even warned about that. That should have been the shot across the bow, saying, "Okay, maybe we need to really reevaluate our approach here because they just told us we're not ready." But no, we're fine. Just keep on going. So it was, I mean, a classic case of ignoring the RFP as the incumbent.
Hmm.
It might have been somewhat different. I don't know what the exact requirements were
Right.
beforehand. I can't comment on that intelligently. But they gave them multiple chances to fix themselves. And they just said, no, I'm fine. I'm good.
Yeah.
So
You
it
know,
was,
it
yeah,
kind of
pretty bad.
it just kind of dumbfound me that a proposal got so far to the evaluation process that it was not
Right?
responsive and not compliant. I would expect that from writers or capture or BD. But if you're the proposal person and that's all you're solely responsible for, to let
Mhm.
that get that far, it kind of almost makes me wonder too, is that, like, you mentioned something about reading the room. And I think that's
Mhm.
really kind of important. And sometimes reading the room and doing the right thing can be really difficult, especially when you've got some very powerful personalities or people
Yes.
in a leadership position that are leaning heavily one way that maybe the wrong way, like on the BD capture people that I normally wouldn't have done it this way, but what am I supposed to do? I get outranked, or someone
Yep.
else above me made the decision that ultimately I didn't make. So that's I think that happens a lot more common
Oh, you're right.
than people just being negligent.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I think that what you've identified, those sort of those Game of Thrones political dynamics that happen inside every business. Well, not every business. Some businesses operate that way. Some are, I think, much more sane and much more respectful of each other.
Hmm.
But I think what you illustrated is it very well could have been the C-suite said, "Nah, we're not doing that." I was involved in a big capture, not related to this, where, I mean, the team, those guys had it locked down, huge, $500 million pursuit, and they had it locked down. And the
Hmm.
C-suite just took their solutions and we're not doing that. Well, who the hell are
Yeah.
you? These guys did the capture, they did they did all the groundwork, and you just said, "Nah." Like, come on. So I think what you picked up on is very possible, and we'll never know necessarily.
Yeah.
But right, that's where the C-suite sometimes can just say, "We know better. Ignore the
Yeah.
requirements. This is what we're bidding. That's what we're going to do." Like,
You can kind of come in and
okay,
sabotage the
how'd
whole
that turn out
process,
for you?
which is unfortunate. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it really is.
Exactly. So speaking of requirements, that kind of takes us to our next segment here, which is ignoring new requirements, right? So I think that's like another critical pitfall is when there are new requirements. And a lot of times, even for incumbent contracts, there are nuanced changes. O&M work, yes, it's probably the same, but um, there's very few opportunities that are exactly cookie cutter the same. And so I like how you phrase it about, incumbents leading, like leaning back instead of leaning in. And they often sometimes lean too heavily on, well, we've done this before, or this is how we've always done that.
Right.
And so, Brian, like how dangerous is it for an incumbent to kind of assume that their past performance guarantees future success, because that's kind of what we talk about in industry, right? Is it's indicative of future success. So, and they lean on that so heavily, which is, I think, quite a big pitfall for incumbents. They have to show up with something else.
Yeah, no, I think something that I make as a habit, if nothing else, for my own professional education, but also I utilize this for competitive intelligence trends and to help inform what we do, is I'll go through protests very routinely to learn about what happened in an interesting opportunity. And I'll tell you, what you were just hitting on is something that I see shockingly often. It's really stunning where that leaning backwards part happens, where they just ignore what the RFP says and say, well, I'm going to go back to what I did before. And I think part of that sometimes is the incumbent team. That's all they've known necessarily for 4 or 5 years. And they may have a hard time adapting to accepting that the ball has been moved and you have to move where the ball is now and make some sometimes significant adaptations. And that's been a great example of that, where there was a significant shift that perhaps the incumbent team didn't see coming, and maybe they just were asleep at the wheel. I don't really know. Like IBM was competing with Accenture some years ago for the big CBP data center services support contract, and that was a big one. And IBM was the incumbent, right? You think data center support, kind of hybrid cloud environment, you think IBM should be good at that, right? Mm. Yeah, it didn't work out too well for them. They it was a new contract, and they had a solution that was so indicative of, I just didn't read the RFP, just didn't bother. And they think they were staffing something. The whole staffing solution they put forward to CBP to evaluate was ignoring what was about roughly, at CBP's own estimation, we changed the scope about 30%. That's a pretty big change for an incumbent contract. So massive shift. And IBM just ignored them. And we can't, obviously you guys aren't paying attention to the requirements at all. What you proposed does not fit the type of skills we need. They were very likely proposing a lot of incumbent personnel who,
Yeah,
I hate to say it, those incumbent personnel may not have been the right people going forward. They may have been great in the previous one. They may have been the right fit, but sometimes your skill set just isn't up to snuff for a new requirement. You're not the right person for that. And that's what happened with IBM, is they just ignored the new requirements. And could they have tooled up to that? I actually think they probably could have. I mean, I've worked with IBM before on other big bids, and there are no dummies. And there's some
right.
really technically savvy folks over there. They just did not read the scope or the room at all. And Accenture absolutely did. They absolutely read the requirements. They bid to the requirements. They put the right people staffing in the job. And they also, by the way, they even had double the price of IBM. They still won. So IBM certainly
Yeah,
was aggressive, but they had pretty big disparity in pricing. That we're okay with this because they have a better bid overall. So we're going to go with the $300 million winning bid. Thanks, IBM,
yeah,
which is too
exactly.
bad.
And I think that's why it's so important to have someone like yourself or me coming in when you're the incumbent and you're doing a recompete, because there's so many blind sides to things. And it's
Oh
very
yeah,
easy for your technical team to say, well, this is what the customer wants, this is what we're doing. And they're trying to shove or, like say, well, this is the solution because this is what we've been doing. We don't want to shake the boat. Um, in fears of maybe giving them something that they're not wanting or not looking at, but ignoring what the requirements are. And
yeah,
so I'm constantly asking my customers, especially when they're incumbents, well, it's like, that's great, but how is that going to change now? Right. So the environment changes. And if you look at some of these multi-million, billion-dollar contracts, we're not talking about a 1 or 2 year contracts. Some of these we're talking 5, 10, 8 year type of contracts,
mm,
right? So a lot of things happen and change in a decade. Technology, processes, people, leadership, it's the whole litany of possibilities that have changed. And so you, as the incumbent, have to be able to um, kind of stay ahead and be able to kind of anticipate the change and move with it. So um, yeah, I think
yeah.
that's
That's
that's a
actually,
huge
that was. I'm
blindside.
glad you brought that up, because that was actually, I think, part of this. Yeah, it was like part of the conundrum here is that
Hmm.
CBP was trying to move into a hybrid cloud environment, because they had previously run their own data centers for the most part, and most of their applications were hosted in the CBP data center. So they had, to your point, they had a massive shift of their entire technology strategy of how they're going to host all these applications that run the beating heart of how CBP operates. And IBM, they had an opportunity to know, well, what's the transition risk to where we have data center work into a hybrid cloud environment? They could have taken advantage of that, and they could have had, well, I know exactly how to map that risk out for you, but they didn't. They were, to your point, they were not adapting to what was then a radical shift for CBP, and CBP could see that it was a risk that I can't take this. These guys are not playing the same game. They're looking at operating a data center again. We're not doing that anymore. We're going to be
Yeah.
moving into a hybrid cloud environment. That's it. That's our strategy. We have to do this to adapt. And if you can't help me adapt, then you're going to be the cause of my demise. And I can't afford that risk, so you're out.
Yeah. Well, not to kind of share strategies here that we've used before, but I'm going to give a free one out here to our intellectuals. But especially when you're an incumbent, it's really important to send out some trial balloons and some test projects prior to your contract being repeated,
Mhm.
recompeted. Because that's a really great way to not only shape the requirements, influence the new set of like scope of work moving forward, but it's also a great way to kind of test your customer and to kind of pre-test the room a little bit, pre-screen who's on board, who's gonna be part of the source selection committee, who really likes this technology, who likes this, and then like do more of that so that when you're proposing your technical solution, your customer's not reading it for the first time in your proposal, right? They should be able to read your proposal and be like, yes, this is exactly what we had talked about. This is exactly what I want. This is exactly where we need to be. It should not be a surprise. You should never put anything in your technical like approach in your proposal that you haven't already been able to harmonize, or at least be able to present to your customer prior to that release or prior to your submission, so that they're not kind of caught off guard
Yeah.
um, with that solution. So there you go.
No,
That's like Tom's 2 cents right there.
there you go. That's more like 5 cents right there. That's pretty good. I think, but it's accurate though, because the proposal is not the win. The proposal
Hmm.
should seal the win. You should have already mostly won
Right.
before that ever happened. So to your point, especially if you're the incumbent, you have unequal access. Let's just call it this: you have unequal access to that customer. Right, so you got to leverage that. If you don't leverage that as the incumbent, I mean, shame on you, frankly, for
Yeah.
not doing that in advance.
Yeah, you deserve to lose if that's the case. So I'm coming for
Yeah,
you because anybody who's not sitting in the incumbent and is the competitor position, they're hungry, and so they're going to gun for you. So speaking of which, though, I think this is a really great segue into like our third segment, which is the overconfidence in teaming and set asides. Set asides are the bane of my existence. Yes, I like to advocate for small businesses. I am out there all the time trying to make sure that the playing field is as fair as possible. But I really want to talk about teaming strategies because you and I talk a lot about the different types of teaming approaches, especially in set aside scenarios. And I think sometimes incumbents often think that if they're able to like think backing a small business might make them unbeatable, or whatever their bid strategy is. But as we've seen, it's not always the case. So, Brian, why is it risky for incumbents to kind of over rely and overplay their hand when it comes to their teaming partners, either status on the contract or their own reputation?
it's interesting because there's that. I'll call this the kingmaker sort of symptom,
Hmm.
right? That you have that there's like the idea of if I have the incumbent backing me up, then I'm now the anointed king or queen. I'm
Right.
I'm I'm the heir apparent to the throne. There's no one in my way. I'm good.
The
No.
Khaleesi's brother. There you go.
Yes,
Right.
there you go. Right.
There you go.
So here we go. So we got our Game of Thrones theme is continuing here very appropriately, but that's. I mean, I've been involved in captures in which exactly that happened, where you had to do a flip from a large business to
Mhm.
a small because of a set aside to happen. Whether it was a set aside maybe to get rid of a large, or the agency just said, I can think a small can do this. Let's go make this small, make our numbers better. Whatever the rationale is, almost partly irrelevant here. In that case, though, the small who is in charge, and that's the key thing you have to keep in mind is that when you put them in front, if you think they're just going to be a figurehead, just doing your bidding, and they're your puppet and you're simply going to tell them what to do, well, the reality is they have to be able to convince that customer that they are worthy to be the
Mhm.
successor to the throne. And that's not guaranteed because that company, they're going to drive the bid, they're going to drive the price, they're driving everything about that. And they may not necessarily listen to the so called wisdom of the former incumbent. They may say, yeah, that's great. Just like we were talking about a few moments ago, where the C suite just said, yeah, RFP says this, but we're not going to do that anyway. The same thing can happen here. They can rebel, right? You can have
Yeah.
someone, what seemed like a very friendly small business prime could end up being King Joffrey and be a raving lunatic, right? And then King Joffrey, like, okay, that went great. So
Yeah.
perfect type of person to be the ruler of the seven kingdoms. But you might end up with that person. Then you realize, oh my God, my fate is tied to King Joffrey. We're all screwed. And that's what happens very
Right.
often, more often than you might realize, but probably not more often than you realize, but maybe more often than many people realize that will happen. Or the agency goes, like to the point you just made a few months ago, vet them with the agency. It's like, here's my guys. I'm going to work with them. What do you think? Right. So then
Mm-hmm.
if they
Mm-hmm.
start looking at each other, what the hell are these guys? Maybe not the right heir apparent. Maybe I need to go, well, thanks for playing. I need to go a different direction. You know, there's a lot of ways how this can go horribly wrong, but to vet that small and say, here's what I think their experience looks like to you. Does that appeal to you? There was an example of
Right.
that where Chevo Consulting was the King Joffrey of Deloitte on a big FEMA contract. FEMA said, we're making the small business set aside. And Chevo was put in front. Deloitte was their incumbent subcontractor. And Chevo did not do too well in the evaluation. The pricing wasn't a
Mm-hmm.
problem. It was the evaluation, specifically past performance. So Chevo put forward some CISA example. Hey, FEMA, this work we did at CISA is just the same
Yeah.
thing. And FEMA said, excuse me? Um, no, it really isn't. I don't think you guys have an idea what you're doing. So I'm going to say, even though you have Deloitte on your team, I'm going to say hard pass. Thank you for coming, but we're going to go now. We're going to go with somebody else who came out of nowhere to win that bid. So it was a classic example of that. I'm going to get a guess that that small was not vetted properly. Maybe it was a last minute shotgun wedding. Maybe
Yeah.
Deloitte got caught surprised and go, you're small. I know your guy. We know we do bourbon together. Therefore, you're a good teammate. Or we have no other options. Who the hell knows what the reason may be? I don't know. I don't want to assume that. But it clearly was not well vetted or tested with FEMA because FEMA said, I'm bouncing you, even though you've got my former incumbent prime behind you who had the right skill set to get this job done, but it still wasn't good enough. The prime has got to drive it. The prime must be credible. It became also evident to FEMA that these guys are standing on the shoulders of Deloitte too much. If Deloitte decides to not really be invested in them, they're going to
Yeah.
fall apart and we're all screwed. So there are a lot of things that
Yeah.
went
So
south on
this
there.
Yeah, so the scenario you're talking about as far as, like the small business prime now backed by a
Mm-hmm.
larger, that typical fronting a small. Um, I think government contractors seem to think that the government's stupid for some reason. It's like, oh, you're not going to notice that you've got like an 800-pound gorilla like backing you. And here's the thing too, is that on the flip side, and this is where, yes, I do advocate for small businesses, but yes, I will tell you when you're like playing out of your league, is that some small businesses feel very intimidated to go after an opportunity alone or go after the opportunity without the incumbent
Yeah.
or, without a large behind you. You don't need that. If you've got a really great story and you understand the customer and you understand what their needs are and you're going to show if their customer is into innovation or like again read the room, right? Don't propose innovation if the customer is like risk averse, right? That's like the kiss of death. But you can win without the incumbent. It is really important to not only like vet who, especially if you're the incumbent and now you need someone else to front it, like an more commonly than not in 8A set aside type of bids where you're no longer the 8A. Now you've got to front and bring on another 8A to to front your contract that now you're the sub on. It is really kind of important to not only vet those properly, but at the same time the small businesses also need to, like you said, show that they can command and be the prime.
Right.
You know how to lead, know how to like do things differently, and it's okay to do things differently. It's okay to kind of, propose a different type of management style or whatever. But it is hard sometimes for incumbents, especially if they're larger, to kind of take a backseat role, and they end up bullying, the small business prime now, which is not a good, scenario. But more often than not, the teaming is usually very successful. But you really do need to kind of evaluate, is it beneficial for you to go in alone or go with someone else who's not the incumbent? And it's
Yeah.
different every single time.
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. Where if you're a small business prime, and it's interesting, I see the psychology of some small business primes I've worked with, and I look at them and I ask them, well, why not you? I mean, if you have all the right building blocks to do this credibly, then why not you? Why don't you go for this? Because I remember my first job out of the Navy was working for a small business prime. We had a very niche spot we worked. We would routinely go toe to toe with Lockheed Martin, with
Yeah.
SAC, and with others, and we would kick their teeth in because they played in our sandbox, and we had limited capabilities. But when we played in our niche, we were undefeated more or less on a lot of contracts. We would just keep beating the snake out of them because they were playing our sandbox. And I think that helped me realize that yes, the small, scrappy company can pull off a victory if it's something that's a good fit for them. So I think that that
Mhm.
piece of advice to just ask yourself, why not me, is
Yeah.
very appropriate.
Yeah, exactly. But obviously there's some risks to that, right? So I think that that leads us really well into like our next segment, what you call the Han Solo syndrome, the risk, what risk type of conversation. Um, so the Han Solo syndrome is the belief that risk just rolls off because you're the incumbent, right? There's no transition risk, there's no
Yep.
risk whatsoever because you're the incumbent. Why would there be? And so I think this overconfidence, this hubris, this arrogance, a lot of times really kind of backfires. Sometimes it works, a lot of times it doesn't. So Brian, what are some of the warning signs that an incumbent is underestimating those risks?
I think that one of the biggest things I see when it comes down to risk is how does a customer pick up on risk? Think about that. And
Mhm.
and often I find that the way that they understand risk is if you are, as the bidder, you are sober, you are aware, and you are transparent with what you see. Here's
Mm,
where things could go horribly wrong. And you outline this. Here's how there's going to be risk in this. Here's my solution. I acknowledge there's some risks here. Here's how I'm going to identify this risk. Here's how I'm going to mitigate that risk. So you're then explaining to them that you are sober, you're not delusional, you don't think that there's some sort of like this sort of Pollyanna view of the world that nothing's going to happen. It's never a rainy day. It's always sunny and beautiful out. No, no, there's going to be some things
it's
that's going to
rainbows
happen.
and purple unicorns. Come on.
Exactly, right? Right? It's that. That's they put that in the cover of your proposal. Rainbows and purple
Yeah, rainbows,
bunnies and
yeah.
perfect, right? So it's all a sunny day. But these evaluators, they are not stupid. So try treating them like they're stupid. They're not stupid. They're very smart people. They know what they're looking for. So just be sober about that. And I think a lot of examples I see of things I've been involved with directly, or even in looking at things like protests, where you will see a bidder, with in many cases the incumbent, saying, "Hey, it's me." Doing kind of the Han Solo syndrome, but it's me, right? Think about that scene from Return of the Jedi where Han Solo looks like it's me. Then everyone goes, "Oh God, this is not going to go well." But you see
It's
that,
you, right?
yeah, it's like it's me. But and this is where often I see these in some technology related bids where there's an example that comes to mind of a company called XLA Associates. They were up against Capgemini, and XLA was the incumbent, working for ICE, doing some different IT systems work. And XLA proposed some modest innovations, nothing radical, really, nothing. It was like, we're going to do, they went through, here's what we're going to go in and upgrade your tech stack. But they didn't want to explain how.
Mm.
I'm going to do this. And then ICE is wondering, and how do you plan to do that without breaking my stuff? And XLA just sort of did the, eh.
Don't worry
I'm
about it.
good.
We got it covered. Yeah,
Right, we got it. Right, exactly. I got it
we
covered. It's
got it.
me. Come on,
We
man. You
got
know
you.
me.
Yeah.
And then Capgemini came in and won that away from them. It wasn't like a wildly different bid on price. It was just that they inserted risk as the incumbent. They probably, I'm gonna guess, they failed to float those ideas in advance of the proposal. Or perhaps they just forgot to
Yeah.
explain what they already convinced the customer on, this is a good idea. They just didn't explain it, so they couldn't evaluate it. Therefore, they lost, which is a real shame.
Oh my God. You bring up such a great point, is that I think sometimes um, this happens sometimes with myself and probably you, because we've been in the business for so long. You know how sometimes we just talk about things and we just expect everyone to like understand, or like, you got me, right? Like, you understand what I'm saying without actually explaining it. And so I forget sometimes I need to provide some context. And
Yep.
so it's like, oh, wait a second. And so your technical approach is kind of like your context. It's, yes, we're going to follow ITIL or whatever framework or methodology, but you still need to get into like the how are you going to do it? The
Yes.
people, processes, and tools, right? So, um, it's almost sometimes you think, well, if I just throw out a fancy, like industry term, well, then the government or the customer is going to know exactly how I'm going to do it. And you can't assume that.
Right. You can't evaluate something that's assumed. You have to state it. You have to write it down. You have to make it so they can say, yes, this is what I understand. This is what I think they told me before. This is now what I understand to be the trace. So now I can say with a straight face and document, here's how they're going to do it. Therefore, I feel comfortable about a less or lower degree of risk, or at least the risk is being made clear to me. Then I can move on with it. You're
Hmm.
absolutely right. If you don't mean, you can have those conversations, but you cannot assume that one, they're going to remember it, and two,
Yeah.
they can't evaluate their own memories. You have to
Well, they
evaluate
actually
what you
evaluate
submit.
what's there. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
right. You can't. It's when the four
Hmm.
corners of the page is what matters.
Right? Within that page limit, within those sub factors and those sections. Yeah, and it's funny too, is like the other strategies that incumbents like to use too, from a risk perspective, is that we've got all the incumbent capture, right? Like we've got the incumbent staff, you've got the same
Hmm.
manager or whatever, and sometimes that's the liability. They don't want you. They don't want that management team. Your PM and your capture person or your account executive is probably telling you, oh, they love us. They want the entire, like, you would lose us if you didn't get us. And I've actually won, a pretty large contract against a very long incumbent. I outscored them on their technical, their management, their staffing. How is that possible? Management and staffing, you should have like totally outscored me on, but I
Right.
beat you on management and staffing because they didn't have the right mix. They didn't have the right people. They just kind of, well, we're going to beat the same people. Like, like it's the job descriptions are written for them. And sometimes they're not intentionally. So you really do have to not only read the room, but read the solicitation and kind of see, what's different.
Yeah, it's interesting about that too, because when you're going up against the incumbent, and sort of related to that is often the incumbents think, well, only I
Hmm.
understand my employees. Think so? Really?
Mm.
And even whether they want them back or not. And there's sort of this belief that they are loyal to me, they will die for me. You sure about that? They probably won't,
Yeah.
right? There may be a few that are diehard employees of that company, and they will die on that hill, and they will do it with a smile on their face. But for the most part, they got mortgages to pay, they got kids to put through college, and all that wonderful jazz. And if the company loses and the new company comes in who can make them a reasonable offer, then okay, I'll switch. See you later.
Yeah.
I'm out of here. I saw it was actually interesting. Where even you can make some adjustments where you can adjust the staffing a little bit as the challenger versus the incumbent. Say, do I need all these people full time?
Mhm.
Maybe I can. There may be a couple of SMEs who I really don't need to have full time. That I can do better when I can call them in when I really need them. The pro from Denver or the pro from Dover, and then bring them in and let them go, let them on their merry way when they're done. There was a big upset that Amentum did versus VSE recently on that one, where they took out VSE, who had been doing some FMS work for the Navy for 25 years. Momentum came in, just did some slight twists on the staffing model to take some people, yeah, let's take these guys, put them 1099. The rest will keep intact. We're not going to make, we'll make a couple of adjustments just to tinker with the staffing model a little bit. It'll save you some money. You won't lose any access to SMEs. And then NASD said, cool, we'll do that. Bye, VSE, thanks to your, and the VSE was, they lost their mind. But no one else understands these people. They won't be able to keep these people,
Yeah.
and no, they're keeping them. They got it pretty well nailed down. So you buy VSE, your service no longer required. But it was that minor adjustment to take out the incumbent. That was an interesting plot twist there, where yeah, your people are not loyal to you, and there are some minor twists you can make to save some money but not lose any of the expertise that you need. So they're not that special necessarily.
Yeah, incumbent contracts get very top heavy and they get very expensive.
They do.
Um, and so you want to keep the same people, and you can't always keep the same people. You've got to, green the forest and provide some type of pricing advantage. And it's hard when you're the incumbent too. It's like who do you let go? Who
Mhm.
is no longer going to be part of that incumbent team, right? So again, it's not always the easiest being the incumbent. So this is a really good
Okay,
place for
gotcha.
us to talk about turning incumbency from liability to advantage. So let's discuss some solutions. We talked a lot about some of the challenges and pitfalls that incumbents have, but Brian, how can incumbents kind of turn their status from a liability to an advantage? And what steps do you think incumbents can take to avoid some of these traps that we've been discussing?
I think, frankly, one of the ones you just illustrated a few moments ago, I think we need to come back to that, where the incumbency, where you can test those ideas in advance, right? Don't wait until 3 months before the RFP and then let's be innovative all of a sudden. That's where there's going to be hopefully some measurement of continuous process improvement, some other continuous improvement measures that you as incumbent are engaging on a routine basis to show you're leaning forward. But at least as you get ready for that recompete in, let's say, the final year or so of the contract, to start floating that here's things I've been observing that we think we could do. And let's test that out. Let's make sure we can test their appetite. And that will obviously influence our solution. You captured that, I think, magnificently, which is something the incumbent can and should do to show that they are thinking in advance and thinking and leaning forward to what's happening next. I mean, honestly, one of the things that as I go back through some of these examples we were talking through, where incumbents, even in the midst of a potentially significant change, like I think the IBM example with the CBP DCSS,
Mhm.
right? So CBP was going through a major change. They were going from, we got our data center, okay, now we need to enter the digital age, and there's this cloud thing I keep hearing about. Let's give that a shot, see how it goes. So
It's
I'm
not
a
going to
little tongue
stay
in cheek
around.
there. They were,
Yeah,
yeah, hey,
cloud's not sticking
maybe it's not
around.
a fad anymore. I actually, the guy running that part of CBP, Ed Mays, he's a really sharp guy, and I know he's a big forward thinker. So, but they were at a time where they could exercise that hybrid cloud approach. Like we're going to have some of our own hosting, and then we're going to use a hybrid environment to get that done. In that case, think about that with the example. If IBM could have said, "Well, here is, let's work through the transition problems we're going to face as we take an ancient data center." It was ancient. All right, they got duct tape and hope, hamster wheels back there. It's an old tech stack. Then we're going to make a massive leap. So, what kind of risks are we going to engage to get there?
Hmm.
And let's make sure we do that and really measure out where the risks are and how many. That's your unique. You know where the bodies are buried. You know that this application, let's move this one sooner. And the other guys who come in, they may be able to do an assessment, but they're still going to be behind the curve on where you are. So that bigger picture is, you know where the bodies are. You should know where the risks really are. So as you try to lean forward, do the right thing, then to use that knowledge to your advantage to show the customer that I've got the risk figured out. Let's map it out. Here's how we can get it done to make sure that any innovation that's proposed is something that's based in, being pragmatic in reality. That's huge. I think that, I mean, the mission environment, because there's plenty of things you can look at. I'm sure you've, just like I have, read SOWs where you go, I could have copied and pasted this out of ChatGPT, for God's sake. This says nothing, right? I think, what's the context here? We're going to do program management, blah, 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 budget, blah, blah, blah. this means nothing. But the flavor of the mission and the mission environment, to
Mhm.
know what the internal stakeholders are expecting, to know what the mission requires, how do I temper what my plan is with the known op tempo of that mission and that agency, how they really operate. That's again your unique flavor. I mean, someone could probably hire some consultant who came from the agency to help them understand it, but even then, that one masked avenger can only do so much. If I've got an incumbent team who everybody lives through that dream, they should know the beating heart of that mission, of that agency, and what they're really looking for, to make sure you can adjust what can be a vanilla SOW and write with some color to what they're expecting to see, and make sure it's tailored to it. So it's not just from generic tech volume, right? I mean, to me, those are some easy things to do to turn your incumbency into advantage, where it's not going to be a liability for you. It's actually an asset. So those are just things that come immediately to mind for me.
Yeah. And what about past performance too? Like a lot of times, one of the strategies is, um, you use your current contract as your past performance because no one else can kind of claim that. I've seen
Mhm.
that go both ways. I've seen that be really good. And I think when you're the incumbent, incumbents get lazy when it comes to writing, or when it really kind of comes down to talking about accomplishments and different things like that. I think they do a good job in certain places, but the past performance is one of the you know the redheaded stepchild. It's totally neglected. It's the last volume that ever gets done. It's the one volume that's never evaluated, but it can really make or break. It's like you're kind of losing a missed opportunity to really discuss some, metrics and accomplishments in your past performance write up, because you're the only one who can actually, claim that past performance without saying as the incumbent, right? Like how many times
Yep.
can you say as the incumbent,
Yeah, right. That's where I think you have a gag reflex, kind of a problem where if you say as the incumbent one more time, I'm going to slap the taste out of your mouth.
right?
Please stop doing this. This is just ridiculous. We got it. We know you're the
Yeah.
incumbent. We got it. But I think your point though is well taken. Where and to capitalize on that and show when in the beginning when the Earth was just formed and I became the current incumbent until now, here are the measurable improvements that we have made in the
Mhm.
programs and performance. Right, we have reduce costs by X. We've increased availability from, let's say, 95% to 99.92%. We've done, but then not just saying these stats, but also showing here's how. Here's how I did it.
Right.
And now here's what we're going to do to keep this trend going forward. And that is the forward leaning part, because I think it's important to have a really powerful past performance narrative, but sometimes it sort of drags you back into being nostalgic and not leaning forward. So it should, I think, also to take advantage of that. If you know where the puck is moving on the ice, I would shape your past performance write ups to focus on here's the experience that will carry me
Right.
forward into the next iteration of this thing. Right. So certainly not don't let them forget about the cool stuff you did. But if there's something that, like to your point, the past performance write up sometimes can be a problem for you, especially I think where I've seen that score very poorly is when, yeah, I'm the incumbent and the agency says you're incumbent. That's great. But guess what? The current contract is so wildly different than what we plan to
Different.
do next
Yes.
that this past
Yeah.
performance is kind of irrelevant. Like, who cares? So to shape that with a forward leaning mentality of, well, this scope's going to change by 30%. What in my repertoire can I bust out there and say, guess what? Yeah, you know who I am. It's me. And
Mhm.
that's great. But here's what we've done for others that are reflective of you and your future path. So we're still the
Yeah.
guy to stick with you. We're not becoming irrelevant.
So I'm going to put a pin in that conversation and say needs to be part two of the Ton and Brian conversation, is past
There you
performances.
go.
You need to come back and we need to talk about that, because past performances are the bane of my existence. And it is the one area that trips everybody up, because they mistakenly think that corporate experience is past performance. They're not the same.
They're
They're
not.
nuanced and they're
You're right.
different, and they're not quite leveraging the right past performance strategy, because a lot of times people try to shove. Let's say we've talked a lot about the HS recently, so let's just say you're going after CBP bid. You don't always, because the scope might be different, you don't always say or can prove that you have a CBP past performance that has and covers all of these other new areas or the new technologies or whatever. You have to find, a tangential like past performance that shows that you've done this somewhere else before, so that you can show similar size, scope, and complexity. And so it may not always be with the end customer, and that's okay. And to get people to think that that's okay and to let that go, is really, really challenging. And people don't like to do that. So sometimes you have no other choice, and sometimes that's the better call to make. But, anyways, we're going to talk about past performances in a whole other episode. But intellectuals, as we wrap up here today, we've got a couple of different takeaways, and Brian and I have talked about a lot of different things regarding pitfalls about being an incumbent in GovCon. And so some of the takeaways are just being overconfident about your incumbency can really kind of like blind you from reading the room, reading the requirements, or even reading the new solicitation. And also by like ignoring some of the potential risk in the new contract or your previous contract and not calling those out. And we also touched a little bit about some teaming strategies and some teaming issues, especially when you were the incumbent and now you're flipping and now you're the sub to a new incumbent. I'm sorry, to a new prime. There's a lot of challenges that you need to kind of overcome as far as trust, accountability, a new cadence, just a new contractor that's going to be taking over this contract. And also, lastly, like we've mentioned here, you can't assume that your customer is going to be loyal to you or that your past performance, especially on this contract, is going to outweigh, another potential competitor in there. So there's so many other things. Brian, a couple of other points that you might want to make as far as takeaways.
I think you stick the landing, Ton. I think honestly, no, you got it nailed. Those are some big takeaways here. In the end, you and I think this is why we get along so well. We're both working towards the same objective of helping people win. And sometimes we help them win despite themselves,
Oh,
where
God.
they do
Yeah.
things or say things where I know I'm proud of what you've done so far. I'm impressed with some of the really cool work that you've done. However, you're stuck in the past. You're not thinking about the future. You're being a bit arrogant and I think overly prideful. So it's time to bring you down. That's why I use like a black hat. Often it's a scared straight sort of the set.
It's
I'm gonna
very
scare the Jesus out
humbling.
of you,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I tell them I'm coming for you. And I'm not pulling any punches. You're gonna see the savagery here. I'm gonna do some full on Game of
Yeah.
Thrones, you live or you die kind of a thing. But that's exactly what you have to do. Think sometimes to shake someone up, not to be mean, but to scare them straight, to get them back on the path to a win. So no, I think these are some good takeaways that are very important for people to understand, and I look forward to our next conversation.
You just need Cersei in your corner, right? She's just going to tell you how it
There you
is.
go. Oh, she
I,
will.
I don't think I want to be the Khaleesi anymore. I think I'm actually like Cersei Lannister because I am the crusher of dreams. I come in and kill more opportunities than I probably support. But again, hey, you're paying for it, right? Like, would you rather me yes you all day long and have you lose, or me come in and say, hey, I would rather you spend your money on something else and have a higher confidence of win. So anyways, this actually concludes our conversation. I can't believe we're almost up on the hour here on this conversation with you, Brian, and discussing the pitfalls of incumbency. I've been wanting to talk about this with you forever. And I love the fact that you have just recently published a meme that just really kind of foreshadowed this conversation. But to our intellectuals out there, I just want to thank you for your support and to remind you to please subscribe and follow our podcast. Stay tuned for future episodes each Wednesday here. So, Brian, thank you so much for joining us here today. You've got an open invite, and we are planning on part two.
Sounds good. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed the conversation as always, Ton. So thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. Thanks again, intellectuals, for listening here today. And remember, you have to think big to win big. Be an intellectual. And until next time, keep pushing the boundaries of possibilities.